When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us.
Let me confess something. I used to be a massive Trump hater. I used to think that he was a racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic bigot who only got elected because his rival was oh so terrible. So it was either terrible celebrity versus terrible wife of this guy.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
As I've matured, I've learned to dial back the utter hatred of Trump, and now I mostly just see him as a clueless idiot who has no idea how the world works, hence all his bizarre remarks. That's a fairer way of looking at him, I think, if you don't like him. I sort of see why people might support him. He had terrible competition with scandals of their own, and he's instantly iconic. Plus, it's probably the media that makes such a big deal out of what he said, and I definitely haven't seen the full context. I think the problem is, it's hard to get the facts straight because both sides lie and overbloat shit for their own agenda. From an objective point of view, Biden has done a lot worse, and I'm pretty sure the only reason Joe Biden won was because he wasn't as offensive as Trump on a surface level, although there's probably a lot of old skeletons lying in Biden's closet too. I've spoken to someone who knows Trump, and he said that the person he knows describes Trump as a way better person than he's presented by the news. Also, as a politician, you're going to piss someone off. Left or right. I am sort of embarrassed that I was too consumed by my own hatred of him to see anything he did right. It used to be a one-dimensional viewpoint of Trump is the worst thing since the man with the funny mustache, and that he was going to start a nuclear war by provoking the wrong person and so on and so forth. Yeah. I used to be that guy. I also used to be that dickhead who looked down on his supporters as utterly inferior human beings. I hope I've repented for those sins, because I tend not to be brave enough for politics, as I've hardly discussed politics on my channel. You might be asking right now, what does this have to do with Andor? A lot. Reading this article, I was just groaning my ass off. Oh great, this show is just gonna be another shallow look at Trump and just be Republicans bad, Democrats good, vote for Joe Biden, you dick off. And that anyone who votes for Trump is a racist bigot who supports this and that. It's getting old. I'm fortunate to look past my biases on Trump. Disney should do the same. But of course they haven't. They can't do a balancing act to save their lives. Hence why we've got Star Wars: The Woke Republic. I'm probably never going to read The High Republic because it'll just be invalidated in a few years when Star Wars Eclipse comes out. Nobody even reads the novels except for Disney shill Star Wars Explained. If I'm going to listen to a story, it'll be something more real like Star Wars Legends. With that being said, let's talk about Andor as a whole. I had super low expectations, but was open to being surprised. The makers of Rogue One were making this. I tolerated Rogue One, but I didn't pin the failure of that movie on the people who made it. It's mostly the Disney executives who ruined it. It seems that Disney overwrites the masterpieces and causes them to flop and greenlights the rubbish. Man, do I just hate The Last Jedi. Cassian Andor is a bare bones character. There's no previous connection. He was a secondary protagonist in a story that wasn't really character driven. Out of all the spin-offs they could have made out of Rogue One characters, this was probably the most interesting, but that's not saying much. This show was going to have to make Cassian Andor into a real character from the ground up. Doesn't seem impossible, but since there was no prior investment, Disney were going to have to make us care about this nobody. I had no idea why this story was greenlit. Is Diego Luna just a huge Star Wars nerd or something? What even is the critical response to Star Wars in Mexico? According to Disney shill Star Wars Explained, this show is apparently going to go on for 3 to 5 seasons with 12 episodes each, which is just insane. The Mandalorian is probably the pioneer of this Disney Plus bullshit, and we're still waiting for season 3. Also, this show was apparently made differently than The Mandalorian, with on-location shoots and actual sets being made. It makes me wonder if Disney thinks they found the savior to the abortions that are the Disney Plus rabbit hole of shit. I mean, a competent writer could probably make this show with zero filler, but I'm not counting on it. There would be a lot to talk about, like the origins of the rebellion, the Empire's oppression, martial law, Cassian Andor's life, etc. There's a lot of substance there. Cassian Andor said that he's had to do terrible things in service of the rebellion, and your mind just goes wild with unspeakable acts. But this is Disney. Are they actually going to have him do terrible things? Or are they going to have him do stuff that doesn't punch the gut? Because think of the children. When I imagine potential terrible things that Cassian Andor could do in service of the rebellion, I'm thinking some hardcore stuff like assisting in suicide bombings, killing civilians just to get to one Imperial target, working with extreme groups like maybe the Partisans, or perhaps even killing children to draw Imperials out. I mean, it doesn't have to be overly explicit and graphic. We saw Anakin do heinous dark deeds in Revenge of the Sith. Why not here? Come up with the most brutal yet realistic war crimes you can come up with and have Cassian Andor perform said war crimes. Make him an anti-hero, a character who intends to serve the rebellion, whatever the cost. Maybe by the events of Rogue One, he's learnt a lot, grown some decency, and say that his questionable acts in Rogue One, like him killing his informant, was something he did for the greater good, as in his eyes, he spared his informant the risk of being captured by the Empire, and Rogue One plays out as it does, and we actually give a damn about Cassian Andor this time, and his death in Rogue One, if you're watching this like a marathon, actually makes you cry, because you've been with this guy for 60 episodes, and a 2-hour movie as the finale to this character's story. Sounds like an encouraging premise, doesn't it? Contextualize and characterize Rogue One through 60 episodes. Do not waste a single one. But given the extremely low bar set for Star Wars content nowadays, that's probably not going to happen. You're probably wondering why I keep on watching hollow garbage content if Disney keeps pumping it out. And the answer is that I haven't given up the hope that if we keep criticizing, they'll do better. Because if we can get the most people to hate on this garbage content, Disney will have to step up their game, right? Seems like a very faint prospect, but I haven't given up. I have high standards that I refuse to lower, and I'm hoping that Disney can deliver at least once. The best they've done is Fallen Order and Rogue One. They just need to make something that's an 8 out of 10, and then they'll finally accomplish the minimum standard I have. Asking for an 8 out of 10 story is extremely generous, I think. Disney should be pumping out instant masterpieces, given the resources they have, but instead they contract idiots like Taika Waititi, who was so ignorant he forgot Natalie Portman was in Star Wars. Is that seriously who you're hiring? Star Wars Explained being like, expecting every story to be a masterpiece is just not realistic, is flat out stupid. If you lower the bar like that, they will underperform. Disney should be striving for 10 out of 10 content every single time. They have a vast universe to work with, so it shouldn't be impossible. Hard work, yes, but achievable. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Andor Season 1. Expect lots of Trump jokes. The first 3 episodes premiered on September 21st. First thing I have to say about Andor is that the pacing is quite slow. The first 3 episodes occur and Cassian hasn't even joined the Rebel Alliance yet. They're certainly taking their sweet time with the story, but the upside is, at least with the first 3 episodes there's no filler this time. So let's talk about it. So this show starts on the world of Morlana 1, which is supposed to be a planet owned by a corporate authority. Cassian walks into town and arrives at a bar. Once there, a working girl asks him what he's here for. Cassian asks for someone that comes from Canary. Along the way, 2 patrons are just being douchebags to Cassian for no reason. Cassian's being served first. Boo-hoo, you can wait your turn. Well, these 2 are extremely dickish from the offset, But the thing is, they don't go far enough with it, especially with what happens later. The working girl informs him about a woman who was from Canary months ago, but cannot provide a name. When asked what his relationship is to the woman he's seeking, Andor says that it's his sister. When I first watched this, I was like, wait, Andor has a sister? Well, I suppose this is supposed to be Andor's backstory, so I'm not going to complain. That would be invalid criticism. After leaving the bar, he is confronted by the two dicks who plan to mug him. Well, unfortunately for them, they chose the wrong person to rob. In one of the rare compliments I'll give this show, Andor does a pretty brutal back headbutt and tackles the second guy, bashing the weapon out of him. Now, with the upper hand, Cassian points the blaster right at the second guy's head. The back headbutt was so brutal that it killed the first guy.
Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
And of course, the pathetic second guy begs for his life, and Andor just shoots him without remorse.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay? It's like incredible.
Of course, Andor quickly flees the scene. So, what's wrong with all this? Well, I didn't feel like they didn't go far enough with it. The presentation proves to be the biggest problem in this whole show. That's probably why it's so boring. Now, something I wanted to talk about is that I don't see boring as an absolute prerequisite for bad every single time. Let me explain. Something can be bad because it's boring, but boring doesn't automatically make something bad. It's the same reason a silent film like Nosferatu isn't bad because it's boring. Nosferatu is boring by modern standards because it's a silent film, and modern audiences won't have a lot of care for it, but that doesn't make the film bad. This is what I mean. The reason why I don't take any of the prequel haters seriously when they say the prequels are boring without explaining why is because they have the attention span of a goldfish. Boring is subjective, and because you find a film boring doesn't make it bad automatically. I think it needs to be judged case by case. Talking about Rogue One again, I thought it was boring, but overall, I'd say it's an okay film. Why? Well, that's a difficult question to answer. Boring is always associated with bad. My theory is that the bad kind of boring is something that leaves you empty. Like, as a blatant example, watching paint dry. What do you get out of that?
Absolutely nothing.
But something that's boring simply because it made you drowsy and not because it was empty. That's what I'd classify Rogue One as, because of the idea behind it. It intended to be the direct prelude to A New Hope, showing the struggles of the forgotten heroes who were able to make A New Hope happen, but were overshadowed by the heroics of Luke Skywalker and friends. That is the opposite of empty. It's boring, yes, but it's not bad. I hope I've made my point clear enough. It's difficult to describe. So after killing the Trump supporter and fleeing the scene, he doesn't try to hide the bodies for some reason. Pretty interesting start actually, but after seeing that, the show goes downhill incredibly quickly. I also wanted to talk about what Andor just did. I feel like they didn't go far enough with it, as mentioned before. Our introduction to these two guys of them being a dick to Andor, and then trying to mug him, and then their plan backfiring. That's it. When Andor shoots the guy out of spite, or not wanting to get caught with murder, or whatever, it doesn't feel earned. An example of this sort of thing done correctly is the movie Joker. Context. In that movie, the main character Arthur Fleck is fired from his job after a co-worker lies about him buying a gun, after it slips out of his pocket despite his co-worker being the one who gave him the gun. So Arthur, down on his luck, is taking a subway back to his home. We see a woman and 3 upper-class guys. The 3 guys are harassing her and generally being misogynistic. Arthur, who has a condition that makes him laugh uncontrollably when he's stressed, starts doing it. And the woman takes this as her opportunity to leave and go to another tram. The 3 Wall Street guys surround Arthur, mocking him and asking him what's so funny. Arthur tries telling them about his condition, and they grab him, intending to bring him harm. The things they say like, "I'll tell you what you have, you asshole." And when Arthur tries to resist by kicking, one of them has a smug, "We got a kicker, huh?" before telling the other two to hold him steady and punches him hard, in a way you can tell he did not pull that punch. He wanted it to be as painful as possible. The two then join in with kicking Arthur while he's down, with no remorse. In fact, they laugh sadistically while they do it. Arthur then turns the tables by shooting and killing two of them, with another one immediately dropping his act and flees, pleading for help. Throughout all of this, you can tell that these guys are cowards. They use the advantage of 3 against 1 to get away with heinous deeds, and once the last guy realized he messed with the wrong person, he flees and calls for help immediately. That's the definition of shallow. Arthur then ends up gunning the third guy down because the police probably would have believed the Wall Street guy over the guy dressed like a clown. When you watch this scene, this is where you feel the satisfaction of these 3 guys getting karma like a freight train. There was nothing redeemable about these 3. They were misogynistic, they were smug/pretentious, and the last one was a coward. Compared to the 2 guys in Andor, they weren't as imposing or memorable as the 3 Wall Street guys. At the start, their dickish nature towards Andor was because they were impatient. That's it. In that sense, they can easily pass off as rude but frustrated. Anyone could come across people like this, so the established start for mugging Andor isn't really there. As I said before, they try to mug him, and they're clearly 100% in the wrong, but they aren't as hostile and terrible as the 3 Wall Street guys. Andor uses self-defense, but I think the reason it wasn't satisfying as in Joker was because you're not really with Andor as he does this. You're not feeling as he's feeling. Andor mostly has been some random guy with the personality of a rock rather than an identifiable protagonist. Andor doesn't really feel like he wants to kill these guys, or even that he's trying to protect himself from a mugging. He's had no personality thus far. Or in Rogue One. Also, when the first guy dies, the second guy talks like we're supposed to feel sorry for his friend. It's a very weird feeling. I think for this to work, it should have started with something more easy to get behind. Like, for example, them trying to harass a woman, or beating down a homeless person on the street when no one's looking. Something like that. I've heard the counter-argument that it was a moral grey moment, but I mean, Joker was in the grey too. Arthur was not a good person, but he wasn't bad either. At least not until he goes insane and fully turns into the Joker, and kills people he probably shouldn't have. In fact, Star Wars itself has done this sort of thing well too. In Darth Bane Path of Destruction, the man who becomes Bane, Dessel, who was also down on his luck, since he's stuck in indentured servitude with his job as a cortosis miner essentially, he plays a bark with some Republic officers, including an ensign who is smug and pretentious. He plays Dessel in the card game, and loses, making him go ballistic and trying to lunge at him. He's a sore loser. He also has a delusional rant at all the locals surrounding him that the Republic protects them and that they're all ungrateful. Pretty much the opposite of sympathetic. This guy is clearly from a wealthy system and was probably spoiled rotten before joining the Republic army. It's also an easy inference to make too. Later, when Dessel is walking back to the barracks, the ensign and 2 other officers ambush him with the intent to kill him. Through a premonition, Dessel detects a vibroblade being pulled out by the ensign, counters his attack and kills him. The 2 other officers run away, intending to tell their superiors a falsified version of what happened, causing Dessel to escape off-world with help from a Nemoidian named Groshek. Event leads to another, and eventually, he's the Dark Lord of the Sith. I suppose in a lesser equivalent, Anakin killing the Sand People too after his mother dies by their hands. That was oh so great, because Anakin slaughtered the entire village. Not just the men, but the women and the children too. The Sand People are savages, and Anakin took it out on them in turn. All 3 examples I just gave with Joker, Bane and Anakin all work, while Andor doesn't. I think this is important because as the main instigator for the entire story, I think it's essential that Andor gets the whole thing across effectively. but it doesn't. Also, one last thing. Andor doesn't struggle with any of this. He comes off as indifferent and then annoyed after he turns the tables. Anyways, when Andor retreats, he returns to his home on Ferrix. After a boring, drawn-out sequence of a droid, the droid in question goes up to Andor sleeping in his home. It's here where we get the first flashback. We see that Cassian was from the planet Canary, which is a retcon because he was originally from Fest. But later in episode 2, they do address the retcon by saying that Fest was a falsified documented homeworld. So I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here, since they actually bothered to explain this for once. There isn't a lot to say with the first episode. It's mostly a drab, boring, slice-of-life story of Andor. The pacing in the episodes is terrible. Our pilot to a show is supposed to convince you to watch more of it. All episode 1 does is just be set up for future episodes. Honestly, the first 3 episodes should have been condensed in one. This series could have, and probably should have, half the length of the episode at best. This show feels like a waste of time. Rogue One felt at least you got something out of it. So I guess Andor counts as the bad kind of boring by my definition so far. If this show was supposed to be about the Trumpian world, they could at least be as entertaining as Trump whenever he opens his mouth to say something.
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
We get introduced to a guy who looks like discount Tobey Maguire. He looks like he would be Spider-Man in a shitty television movie. This guy's investigating Andor since the 2 guys he killed work for a corporation that specializes in who knows what. Recounting what happens in the show is really hard. Despite him being a secondary protagonist essentially, I don't remember anything about him beyond being dead set on finding Andor. I never caught on to why he dedicates himself so much to finding Andor. Is it because he was friends with the 2 guys Andor killed, or was it because he wants to get promoted for a job well done? I don't know. The only other thing of significance in Andor is Bix, this Puerto Rican woman who has a contact in the rebellion who intends to buy one of Cassian's stolen thingamajigs. I can't remember what it is. This show is heavily criticized for being so forgettable, and I agree. Also, like most Star Wars products by Disney, nothing here looks like Star Wars. It looks like some kind of cyberpunk world that is stuck in the Stone Age or something. It's pretty hard to describe. People say that there's a lot of planets in Star Wars and use that as an excuse for a lot of the places looking like Earth, but that's stupid. Star Wars during the George Lucas era had plenty of locations and managed to make them all different from one another, even if they shared terrains. For example, what's the difference between Kamino and Manan? Kamino is a rainy planet home to a race of eugenic cloners Addicts Extreme with a cold and sterile environment. Manan is a sunny planet home to a traditional fish-like people who provide a healing substance and has a peaceful nature. What about Coruscant and Taris? Well, the differences also come down to similar factors. Taris is heavily pointed out as an exploitative, capitalist society full of crime and corruption, almost like Coruscant in some ways, but it's nowhere near as poor, and the standards of living are very far apart. Taris is Coruscant out of its golden age. I think the thing about planets in Star Wars is that the planets require memorable parts on what's in it. There should be an identifiable gimmick to it, and something that makes it stand apart. The characters, aliens, cultures, maybe even super unique terrains make the planet, rather than just the planet itself. The reasons why the planets are forgettable, and I don't remember them in Disney Star Wars in general, is because there's nothing to them that make them stand apart. Anyways, the Rebel Contact is sort of a central character in the show. I say sort of, because I can't remember him for anything except being a rebel. We also see that Bix has a boyfriend named Scottish Slag, because I forgot his name. All this guy exists for is to rat Andor out once a wanted poster comes out for him. Later, he's killed off, so this character literally had no point beyond bringing discount Tobey Maguire to Ferrix. Speaking of him, he assembles a team to capture Andor, and once he gets the information he needs, he sends a small task force. We also see Cassian's adopted mother, whose name I can't remember, and who also doesn't do much unless it's in the flashbacks. She was a scavenger during the Clone Wars, and Andor used to be part of a tribe. A separatist ship, or a Republic ship, since the show contradicts what faction the ship belonged to, with separatist symbols and then referencing it as Republic or something. Great writing, guys. Apparently the guy who wrote this also said they weren't really into Star Wars. It shows too. Kind of explains why the weird writing that isn't Star Warsian in the slightest, and the terrible, non-Star Warsian looking sets and whatnot. This is more alienating than Rogue One. If you're looking for something that's good Star Wars, fly past Andor. Do it. Basically, while the show takes its sweet time, Andor meets Bootstrap Bill. I'm calling him that because I can't remember a Star Wars name. This show's pacing is atrocious. They talk for a long while, and meanwhile Tobey Maguire and the rest of the hotel staff, because that's what they dress like.
That's a cute outfit. Did your husband give it to you?
Do a search and arrest attempt for Andor, and it ends up backfiring. Bootstrap Bill offers Andor a way off-world if he does a job for him or something. To me, it just seems like he's mumbling something about rebellion. Very bland and forgettable. The fat-ass hotel worker also mutters the word shit.
I can only tell you, if I would have used even half of that word, it would have been national scandal. This guy used a filthy, disgusting word on television, and he should be ashamed of himself, and he should apologize, okay?
On top of it being a big no-no word, it's also out of place. Star Wars has always used fictional curse words, such as blast, Sith spit, fairfeck, etc. There is no fucking shit unless it's in a parody or non-canon work. Those are very earthly words, and should not be used in Star Wars. Doing so in something supposed to be canonical is just ridiculous. He should have said poodoo or something. Adding shit, along with the other weird ways characters talk, just takes me out of the story. I can't even recall if they use recurring dialogue from the films. This is the least Star Warsian thing I have ever seen in regards to feeling. The Last Jedi failed because it failed to understand Star Wars properly. Andor is failing because it isn't even being Star Wars. This show literally has nothing to do with Star Wars, aside from taking place in its universe. I'm not saying that because it doesn't have the Force and the Jedi. That's stupid. Republic Commando went without them to great effect. I'm saying that there is nothing recognizable about this Star Wars product. The only reason this show has retained any viewers is because of the name. This feels nothing like Star Wars. Despite that, this show is inoffensive continuity-wise. It just doesn't feel or look like Star Wars. For once, that's something better than Disney Star Wars, but the problem is that it's fucking empty and boring. Disney Star Wars is almost like a whack-a-mole machine. You hit one, and another one pops up in another hole. It's either blunt or offensive, or dull and empty. There is no balance to the Force here, where they overcome both. Disney, as mentioned before, are literally getting people who understand Star Wars the least. J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, Taika Waititi, etc. People who are so ignorant of Star Wars, yet were tasked with extremely important jobs. It's very tempting to say even Michael Bay could do better, because at least he'd excel at spectacle, a key part of Star Wars. I hate this about Disney Star Wars. They don't understand Star Wars. People who are either super casual or super ignorant are brought on just because they maybe accomplished something outside of Star Wars. I've been told that Looper was the main reason Kathleen Kennedy got Rian Johnson to direct Episode 8, even though regardless of that film, whatever you think about it, is nothing even close to Star Wars. J.J. Abrams was a pretty bad fit too, given he butchered Star Trek before then and doesn't have a single original bone in his body. I'm not even going to repeat what's wrong with Taika Waititi, or what he said that in a just world, he would have been fired immediately in. On top of that, the lead writer for The Acolyte said that she quote-unquote filled the writer's room with know-it-alls and newbies alike, which in Disney speak translates to casuals and ignorance. The know-it-alls, I doubt, would have any idea what a Revan is. I noticed that a lot of this video isn't even about Andor specifically. That's because the other stuff I mentioned is way more interesting to talk about. There's not much to it, and since there's little to talk about that's actually worth a shit, my tangents go off course into more interesting stuff. Anyways, by the end of episode 3, Cassian hasn't even joined the rebellion yet, and in case you're wondering, is nowhere close to doing so. He's put on a job to do a heist to steal something. I don't know, I completely forgot. He's put with a cast of other forgettable no-name characters. The names I have for them are bland, boring, bleh, dull, drowsy, and forgettable. That's my nicknames for them. And I didn't even bother to assign them the name specifically. Just use your imagination. That's another thing. This series makes you go crazy with a better imagination on what would have been cooler rather than what was given. This show is as dull as shit. I was hoping that something crazy would happen to take me out of the boredom and emptiness I face while watching the show. Mon Mothma is in this show, and I couldn't tell you what her role is. She doesn't really incite the rebellion much. I think what makes this show so forgettable is that the characters just talk and talk and talk and talk, blah 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 blah. They don't seem to go anywhere with this show. Progressing the plot here is non-existent. They take one step forward each episode. It's way too slow. J.J. Abrams paced the story like a motherfucker to hide how poorly written it was, but this is just so slow. The pacing is awful, as if I haven't said this a million times over. By episode 6, they're finally doing the heist, and when the heist actually commences, I was actually surprised that it managed to have decent pacing and tension. They take a bunch of hostages and gain access to a vault, and then they take the contents inside, and during all this, I was thinking of how this would make for a much better video game than a series on Disney+. I've said this commonly about a load of Disney Plus shows. They either have a video game vibe to them, but the actual video games being made are still years away. Jedi Survivor comes in early 2023, and that's a major Star Wars title after Fallen Order 4 years ago. It's a slow drog. Aside from this feeling like a video game heist in something like Red Dead Redemption, the shootouts feel exactly like a cover shoot system in a GTA game as well. Would this have made for a better game than a series? Well, anyways, they escape, and then they stop by a medic because one of the thieves was wounded, a character I forgot about immediately. Andor kills one of the other thieves when he turns out to be a bad egg or something. I think another problem is that the show has so many forgettable characters that keeping track of all this is extremely hard. It's around the time you realize that Andor isn't even really a protagonist, despite the show being named after him. He gets like a third of the screen time. He's one of several protagonists. Sometimes it'll just show the perspective of Bootstrap Bill, or Mon Mothma, or Bix, or whatever. I haven't even talked about what kind of character Cassian Andor is, and that's because he has no personality. He's just a dull nobody. Why did they make this a show about Andor? It's easy to get off track because the story being presented is so dull that it's hard to recount recent events. Andor gets a cut of the profits, and then he just goes into civilian life again. He speaks to his adopted mother and Bix briefly, and then he goes on a holiday. I couldn't even tell you what's going on with Mon Mothma. I had to look up other people recounting the story. I said that Shatterpoint was hard for me to keep track of. Andor is even harder to keep track of. Mostly what I was able to follow was Mon Mothma doing political shit that I couldn't tell you what it was about, and then being at home doing parties with other senators and her husband. Yeah, Mothma has a husband. Generation Tech said that it's implied that she's in an arranged marriage, given the loveless relationship presented, which probably explains why they have no chemistry. But then again, none of the characters have chemistry. Andor gets arrested for something I don't remember, and is sentenced to work in a labor camp.
He's a war hero because he was captured. I like people that weren't captured, okay? I hate to tell you.
In case you can't tell, the Trump jokes are what's keeping me alive during this review. He meets Kino Loy, played by Andy Serkis, and this led to numerous fan theories that he would end up becoming Snoke because he was played by the same actor, because we so desperately needed more fan theories on Snoke. Don't people realize that Disney was playing you for a fool? He wasn't Darth Plagueis or the Inquisitor or X other character. He was just a shitty mystery box J.J. Abrams made up to invoke theories and get people excited. He was pathetically weak as a villain and a character. Over the course of like 2 episodes after that, Andor just lives in this prison, which is kind of similar to George Lucas's first film, THX 1138, but without the interesting atmosphere. He then incites the inevitable prison riot that everyone just works there until they die. There's no getting out. At least, not without force on part of the prisoners. I suppose the prison riot was a nice change of pace, but they threw a convenient line where Keno Loy says he can't swim. So he's forced to stay on the prison platform while everyone jumps off and swims away from the prison complex. Andor and another guy escape to some nearby land, and with that, they hitch a ride off-world, and Cassian's mother dies. I'm just hamming things in at this point. I was actually playing Tetris on my phone while I was watching this show. It was so dull and forgettable. When the finale finally came, I was disappointed that the show was wasted for the climax. A climax that felt like it didn't punch hard enough. After the death of Cassian's mother, Andor during the funeral works to free Bix, who was captured by the Empire, to have information extracted from her concerning Cassian Andor. Basically, after a long while of the show not really going anywhere, Cassian's mother, through a hologram, incites a riot against the Empire, and the entirety of Cassian's hometown attacks the Imperial station there. This all leads to Cassian finally being recruited into the rebellion, I think. Exactly halfway through the show, there's a post-credits scene concerning the construction of the Death Star. So that's Andor. I was not as harsh towards this and other Disney Star Wars shows, and that's because this managed to actually be grounded in the Star Wars universe and not break anything about it to my observations. Granted, the show itself wasn't good, it was dull, it had terrible, agonizing pacing, and it doesn't feel like Star Wars. It doesn't look like Star Wars, it doesn't anything like Star Wars. I think the main problem out of all of those was the terrible pacing. The show just progressed too slowly. If it had been half the episodes telling the same story, I think it would have massively improved the watchability. I don't even feel the extended runtime really helped the show at all. Cassian was mostly just a main character instead of the main character. Following Andor, I think, was a mistake. He had no character in Rogue One, and they failed to give him one in the series. His search for his sister went nowhere, as it was just the catalyst for the entire plot. But it itself was a tease, I suppose. Maybe it'll just go somewhere in Season 2, but I doubt it, given she's not really shown or mentioned anywhere after the flashbacks are over. Speaking of, the flashbacks didn't really serve a purpose in the larger story, like the heist, the rebellion rising, etc. I don't recall anything the Empire did bad, in fact. And this show doesn't break canon from my observations, but it doesn't enhance it either. As I said, the series doesn't look or feel like Star Wars. It doesn't even really feel like Rogue One. It has a lot of the same problems as Rogue One, but the tone is completely different. Andor's bad pacing really hindered the gripping of the story. This feels like a novel that's exactly adapted from book to show without proper translation. Obviously, when you're making an adaptation of a book, you need to make sure that the movie can stand on its own. But when a character is thinking something, you need to change the presentation. And that's why there's going to be changes. Obviously, Andor isn't based on a book, but it feels like it is. But it's like they adapted every part of the non-existent book and didn't translate it to work as a series. Andor would have been better delegated to a book because from a logistical standpoint, this isn't going to increase Disney Plus subscriptions, and it didn't. The lack of interest in the premise alone forced Disney to put this on cable television. While Star Wars explained as defending the show, ignorant as always, I'm just sitting there saying, I told you so. This show completely wasted the larger premise of the rebellion rising. They teased Sly Moore, for example, but didn't deliver on the cameo. Believe me, I'm indulging myself on Star Wars, and let me tell you that this is one of the least Star Warsian feeling things I've ever seen. The Last Jedi was terrible for completely different reasons, but it was trying to be Star Wars kind of. It just had no idea what Star Wars was. As I've pointed out, Rian Johnson had no clue how balance in the Force worked because he tried changing it. Andor is the first in the Disney Plus nightmares in terms of shows that avoided offending fans. most of the criticisms come down to its dull and boring nature, and I suppose I'd rather the franchise dry out than it being ruined by a bad story that destroys what came before. There is a line I need to draw between whether something actually ruins Star Wars, or it's just a bad story that doesn't affect the good stuff, or something else entirely, like Dark Empire, which is actually a good story, but hated by those who never actually bothered to read it, especially after The Rise of Skywalker came out and plagiarized Dark Empire. Coming soon. The sequels irrefutably butchered the source material. Rogue One adhered to it, but was dull, and The Mandalorian is a little bit of both, with Dave Filoni pulling Star Wars towards how he sees fit, and retconning pre-established Disney canon. Even the stuff based on his own outlines, like the Ahsoka novel. I'm fine with stories experimenting, but you still gotta feel like Star Wars. Perhaps something like Star Wars is not easy to replicate, but the expanded universe authors for the longest time managed to do it. I don't know why Disney can't. Well, actually, I do know. Dave Filoni doesn't truly understand Star Wars, and he's convinced people that he's an everyman on Star Wars, and everyone looks to him for advice instead of George. Dave Filoni had little to do with the series in particular, but the point is, his influence is everlasting. Andor feels too detached from the films. There's no clever callbacks that I notice, and that line where that character says shit was so out of place, and the way the characters talk feels generic. The only references I noticed was the prison, which people found similarities to THX 1138, but aside from that, nothing. I wasn't going in expecting a masterpiece or a disaster, but rather a bland, forgettable show, and I was right. Just like Star Wars, Andor is not some of the best Star Wars content ever. It's just that a severely limited Disney Star Wars only experience would give you that impression. An easy trap to fall into, but you guys have to realize at some point when something isn't good. So my conclusion on Andor is dull, uninteresting, but not a franchise ruiner. Just something that dragged on for way too long and wasted a story opportunity, but on its own merit, not on that of the OG 6 movies by George Lucas. I wanted this review to be longer, but after watching it, it just ain't worth it. I give Andor Season 1 a 5 out of 10. If it violated rules, it would have been lower. I'm JJ Plagiarisms. And until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes?
Under the mountain, a golden fountain. Were you praying at the Lawrence shrine?